Welcome to Serious Business on NDTV, 30 minutes of hard business news. One topic, sharp insights, and a conversation that's relevant to you. I'm Manvi Sinha Dhillon. Independent directors are in huge demand, with one estimate suggesting that more than 2,000 are set to complete their tenures in April 2024. So it's perfect timing, really, that CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, in keeping with its commitment to raise corporate governance standards in India, has launched a set of guidelines on the appointment of independent directors and the process of board evaluation. So what is the rationale for these guidelines and what are they? Let's find out. I'm pleased to welcome R. Dinesh, President, CII, and Chairman of TVS Supply Chain Solutions, Shailesh Haribhakti, Independent Director, Sanjeev Krishan, Chairman of PwC in India, PR Ramesh, Independent Director and former Chairman of Deloitte India. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on NDTV. Great to have you here on the show. I'm going to start with Mr. Haribhakti. If you could just explain to us what prompted CII to come up with a set of guidelines on independent directors and how you see these guidelines strengthening, the approach to corporate governance in India.
Well, thank you very much. I particularly welcome this discussion with a panel as outstanding as the one that is now visible to your viewers. And the reason why this is so critical is that India is going through a massive churn in the way directors are going to, one, get appointed, two, get evaluated, and three, get a continuity of being on the boards that they serve on. And this has arisen because of the salutary provision of the Companies Act, which requires that in order to maintain your independence, you cannot do more than 2 contiguous terms of a 5-year period. And so as the law was initiated in 2014, in 2024, which is this year, a large number of directors will have completed their tenures, and so it is important for new directors to be inducted. And companies are taking this new induction extremely seriously. That is the context in which CII thought it important to have guidelines, not just for the appointment, but also for the evaluation of directors, because...
And we'll get to that. And we'll get to that in a moment, but I'm glad you've set the context so clearly. R. Dinesh, as a businessman, what are some of the things, in your opinion, that a board needs to keep in mind while recruiting and appointing independent directors?
Thank you, Manvi. So if you really look at it, I think it's a need rather than, a dictate, which I think from a company perspective, we should be looking at from the independent directors. So in the context of this, I would call it such a opportunistic time for companies to be looking at the future. I think it's relevant to really understand what are the capabilities you're looking for from the directors on the board. And if you look at the total business strategy and where they can add value from it. And typically, if you look at it, you either look at it from a strategy aspect of it, you look at it from an HR aspect of it, or from a financial value addition as they could be. So as a norm, I would say you really use the independent directors to benefit the company in its approach to creating value for all its stakeholders. And that's where I think it becomes not just, as I said, a dictate, but a practice which helps companies grow and flourish, as the case may be.
Well, Sanjeev Krishan, if I could come to you, Mr. Haribhakti has already outlined that this is a period of transition, so it's a good time to take stock. That's why these guidelines that CII has worked on really come at a perfect time in a sense. When one is managing this transition, succession planning, transitioning off the board, appointment of new directors, what, in your opinion, are some of the key things to keep in mind while managing this process?
So I would say, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think if you look at the role of the independent director, that's evolved very significantly. Just a few months back, we were debating, and now it is law that they need to approve all related party transactions. They are also in some ways supposed to provide any cover to any whistleblowers and so on and so forth, and those two are enshrined in law. I mean, as per Companies Act, SEBI, LODR, etc., etc. And then there were a bunch of other things which have been enshrined that, okay, these are the duties of the independent directors. But, the ask of the independent directors today is much, much wider. And also, the business is evolving. As was just said, India is going through multiple transitions. We talk about supply chain transition, energy transition, technology transition, and workforce transition. India is going through multiple transitions. There is a disruption which hits India, the world, I should say, not just India, every 6 months, 9 months. Now, in that context, how do you keep your organization safe and also primed for the future? And I think that's where the role of independent directors is somebody who can independently, if I may call it so, continue to challenge the management and guide them on a long-term basis comes in. And that is where I think these guidelines in particular have been helpful. I mean, I'll just talk about 3 facets and, in the interest of time. I think the first one to me is that there should be a certain amount of continuity. You are an independent director today. It is not just you need to do transactional stuff. You need to be able to invest your time in knowing the business of the company better and, thinking on a long-term basis. And that's why we said, 2 terms, possibly one after the other, subject to performance and so on and so forth, etc. So that you know the company better and you can actually guide people and, challenge them also at the same time. I think the second one, which is, again, and it's a burning issue really, the ask of the directors have gone up. How do we keep them secure? How do they keep them safe? And, I think that's where the whole issue about, liability insurance for the directors came along that, should there be so many guardrails placed? Why should they not be, made secure even after they've resigned and gone from the board, etc.? Because the liability is so much, right? And, unless there is something which is proven otherwise, because they're not in an executive role, they're not in day-to-day operations, they cannot be held accountable for stuff which they possibly have not actively approved, so to speak. And the third one really was to say, and also because it gets ownership, is that, there are no free lunches. Nobody has a free lunch, right? So if there has to be a process of continuous evaluation, not just for execs, but also for non-execs, etc. So, there is a continuous process of evaluation of board directors, etc. And, come up with protocols which might change every 3 years. In fact, every 1 year, if you want to change the basis on which you evaluate, etc. And then disclose if somebody is, not working out well, etc., guide him, tell him or her what he or she could do better. And if things are not working out, cause actions as well. So I think it's about creating, the security for the directors to do their job in a world which is disrupted, to be more challengers, etc., but also making sure that they are upskilling themselves enough and they are acting in the best interest of the corporation that they serve.
PR Ramesh, if I can just flesh that out a little more with you, because, certainly in the press that you see calls for, independent directors taking the brunt of some things that go wrong within companies. You see a cycle of independent directors resigning based on fear. We've touched upon this whole idea of insurance, liability insurance for them. But just give us a sort of on-the-ground tips on how we can create an environment where independent directors feel secure to do their jobs.
Thank you. And I think some very good points have been made. But essentially, and I think let me take on from where Mr. Dinesh commented. Why are we looking for independent directors? We're looking for them not just to represent the minority, not just to approve related party transactions, but also contribute to the company. Yes. And contribute positively to the company. So it's not just a governance role. It's not just protecting interests of stakeholders or anybody else, but a contributory role. Now, if you have to bring out the best in independent directors, you rightly said, you need to create an environment in which they can freely express their views. They should be able to participate actively. And when you really look at the whole board processes, there are 3 things one looks at: a structure, a process, and conduct, of course. And that's where you evaluate everybody on. Now, in the current environment, whilst the law is very clear, there's always a fear of the quality of administration of the law. The law is clear that a director is responsible for his acts through broad processes which he has been actively involved in, or if he has been, in a way I can use terms like say grossly negligent. But apart from that, if a director is to be responsible for every single thing, I think it's asking too much. And there have been numerous instances. You could be aberrations where sometimes if a font on a packaging is not of the right size, there is a case on independent directors too. They don't participate in those sort of active things. So I'm sure the dust will settle down, but the independent directors should not only be protected, but feel protected. Now, you can protect an independent director from a monetary penalty, but it's not possible to protect a director from criminal prosecution. And that is the worry one has. And that is why the quality of administration of the law becomes important, and providing that clarity and comfort through actions by all agencies becomes extremely essential.
Right. We've, referred to the fact that, indemnity insurance cover is available. This can all be formalized through written agreements. But I'm going to change gear a little bit and bring our Dinesh in here on the value of diversity in boards. And I ask you this question at a time when, conversations around diversity at the workplace, not just at the board level, are very much alive. And there is the whole ESG agenda that companies are pursuing. So in light of that, reflect on what diversity principles, matter to you in the board composition.
It's a very good question. And if you really apply the lens, and let us first look at it from an economic perspective, then come to the board, right? So if you look at the economic perspective, all of us agree that you can't have 49% of the population not really being fully utilized or employed in the best manner possible. Therefore, in that context, if you then come to the companies and the need for having diversity in the board, first I'm talking about gender diversity and then come to ESG. So if you look at it in that context, I think it is perfect and great to have that diversity taking place at the board for three reasons. First is that, like I said, you have the right voices being heard for making sure that you're taking the right decisions, both from the companies and the country's economic perspective of involving women and others who have not had this opportunity to be involved. The second is that they bring in my view, a very different perspective of approach to not just a strategy, but also the way in which you are going to deal with various other societal issues, which as companies you are continuously dealing with. Finally, which is what we speak about as making sure that you are having, I would call it, the right approach to business and governance. I think you have that diversity also coming on board from their thinking perspective. So all in all, my belief is, again, it is not something which we should look at it as need to have, but it's something which is desirable to have, which helps the company, which helps it in its journey as every company or every organization evolves. In fact, in my view, it doesn't really matter only for listed companies. It matters for every company who is interested in furthering the economic agenda of that business or the country in itself. Going on to the SMG part of it, I think today sustainability is obviously the mainstream for all of us, both as for business reasons and also for the value it provides to our services or products which we manufacture. So in that background, along with the diversity side of it, I think it's also important that we bring in that perspective of sustainability into every decision we take, not just for now, but for the future. So I strongly believe that, again, these are all not, yes, we have to have mandates to make sure that we follow through, but yes, I don't think they are the ones by which we have as requirements, but we believe, and as companies, we should believe in and be able to implement and use them to our benefit.
Shailesh Haribhakti, we've talked about increasing roles for independent directors, therefore increasing responsibilities. We've talked about managing risk in order for them to operate optimally in a safe environment. So that brings us to the whole compensation piece as well. And if you can reflect on the importance of that piece, keeping these other key pieces in mind.
No, I think the CII guideline points very clearly in the direction of making sure that the compensation is commensurate with the value that the independent directors bring to the board table. And what has evolved as a practice is in the largest companies, each meeting is run with a very specific agenda. It goes on for 2 to 3 hours, and therefore there is a whole lot of interaction that happens in committees. And so my experience is that committees are as important as the board. In fact, in one of the boards that I chair, the board meeting is virtually an amalgam of all the committees' report out on what has happened in the more intense discussions that took place. And therefore, the compensation should be viewed in a holistic manner as a compensation for attendance at each committee, at each board, and then a commission which represents a fair compensation for the board's deliberations, time, and engagement. And I think that is what is emerging as a best practice in corporate India. I'm very pleased with the way, in a mature manner, that has happened. What we need to correct, perhaps, is make sure that this equivalence is established in the public sector units and in the startup world in a fair manner, so that exactly as the CI governance guideline talks about, there should be a fair, commensurate compensation for the time and effort that is put in on the board.
Sanjeev Krishan, if I could come back to you, because compensation is based on evaluation. Evaluation is based on performance. And, this whole approach, we've had many years now of looking at the evaluation piece when it comes to independent directors. Take stock of that and spell out what more needs to be done, what is an optimal approach to independent director evaluation given the increased scope of responsibilities.
So, there are certain provisions which are already there. Like, for instance, the NRC is supposed to do this in terms of evaluation of directors and so on and so forth. I think the moot point really was that how do we make this process a little bit more robust and a little bit more structured? So what the guidelines, for instance, do in this particular instance is that they create a bit of a framework for this review to happen in terms of the process to be followed, in terms of the outcomes that one should seek. It's almost, I won't like to call it a KRA kind of a thing, but it almost is sort of creating a framework for this process of evaluation to happen. And I think more importantly than it says, because, a lot of this could be very, very subjective because, as we are saying, they're not an executive role. So particularly for the independent directors and others, it is going to be on, how they've contributed, etc., and so on and so forth. Now, the question also is that how do you, at the end of the day, whether you take external help or not, is really your prerogative. How is it that you talk to them? How do you assess performance? And if you believe that there isn't enough that they are doing in terms of their contribution, either to contribute the current or plan for the future, whether it is on controls, whether it is on risk, and today, as we spoke about so many disruptions and how to keep the company safe, and as we said that every company is different, a conglomerate very different from a young startup company, etc., which is yet to mature. So in the context of the company, in the context of what is challenging them, evaluate that performance, provide a framework, and then have the ability to converse with them if we believe that they're not doing what they should do. Then also to be able to have a conversation with a concerned director to say that maybe the performance needs which we possibly don't do so much at this point in time. That at this point in time the evaluation is done. There are many words, phrases being used, etc. these days, taking the box and so forth. So I don't want to allude to any of that. But yes, the idea is to make this process a lot more formal and be able to coach a person who's possibly not up to scratch and say that ABC needs to be done for you to do better. And then, as I said, because, there is nothing constant today, this whole framework today might need to be evaluated every 3 years. In fact, there was a discussion in the committee that maybe 3 years also is too long because the company might be looking very different in 3 years. Some of young companies look very different in 3 years. So maybe this has to change every year. And, the committee actually said that, if somebody wants to do it every year, so be it. So I think the process really is to make it, to sort of create some framework so that there is some formality to this process. There is communication that, I'm doing well, I'm not doing well, what I could do better. And there is communication by disclosures that what has been done, have we evaluated, have we changed, what is the change that we have made, and what is the action taken on each of these in my annual report.
I mean, I have to step in here and say that all of that makes complete sense. What is challenging is to actually implement it in a robust, consistent way in every board. And, whether it's about following the evaluation steps in spirit and in technicality, it's having those conversations, making those disclosures. And I think the CII guidelines aim to give it, meat, concrete shape, if I can sort of paraphrase using my own words. PR Ramesh, ultimately all of this leads into a more effective board. These are all building blocks for a more effective board. My question to you is slightly philosophical, but I want you, based on your experience, to address it anyway. Board effectiveness. If I throw that phrase at you, what measures would you place as key measures to evaluate board effectiveness?
It's beyond the evaluation mechanism. Your question really is both collectively and directors individually, are they effective? And we talked about bringing the best out of directors. Now, what are those specific elements which one looks at? One looks at, when you're talking effectiveness of the board, it deals with the board processes, which deals with how much time does the board meet? How much time does the board devote to specific items of the agenda? How comprehensive the board agenda is? What is the participation of individual directors in board meetings? In family-run boards, even more that question comes up as opposed to a board where there are no family members in. What is the content which is provided to the directors and how early enough? Because there are challenges there in terms of maintaining confidentiality because there is market-sensitive information. At the same time, you want the directors to be well prepared for a meeting. But most importantly, it is about what do you do with the evaluation findings which come up. Typically, board evaluations, and I've been in some of the largest boards, there are 2 or 3 things which are very good practices. They're also codified in the CII. The first of them is not just to use it to evaluate performance of a director, but to use it to bring out suggestions from the director as to how the board can do better. What are those matters which need to be discussed at the board? What is it the board spend less time on? What is it they can spend more time on? And what new matters? The second thing is, best practice I've seen is where a chairman of a board individually has a session with a director. Because not everything can be captured in a written document, which is sometimes templated, and then you start ticking the boxes. It could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. But it's that dialogue which a chairman has with the director which brings out the best, because you express feelings in. And it's only in those boards where there is an environment where the chairman actively participates or engages with the director, where directors are free to express their views without having feelings of one another or being treated in a different manner. Third, where content is adequate and very comprehensive. And fourth, where hard decisions are taken and where a director has the ability to also dissent, and the dissent is respected without being a director being isolated. I think some of these I could go on, but there are a lot.
Yeah, no, those are key points, and thank you for sharing them. I'm going to turn to Shailesh Haribhakti for the last sort of word on this. You know the CII guidelines well on independent directors, on board evaluations. You've been part of this conversation today. What's the final thought you'd like to leave us with, an area perhaps that we haven't stressed adequately?
So 2 thoughts. One is that the key responsibility of the board is to prevent the business from getting disrupted and proactively look for opportunities to disrupt portions of other value that they can identify in the ecosystem, which will add to the salience of their own enterprise. And if you take that view, then the CIA guideline proceeds along the basic premise that boards should be able to take great decisions. For that, you need a great DNA, you need great processes, you need great participation, and then you need an evaluation so that the feedback loop is completed. And if you see these two guidelines, they brilliantly engage with all of this content and give very practical, easy to follow directions so that corporate India can raise its standards of governance.
Well, I'm going to leave it at that, gentlemen. Shailesh Haribhakti, Sanjeev Krishan, PR Ramesh, R. Dinesh, thank you very much for sharing your insights today. Great to have you on NDTV.
Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it on this edition of Serious Business. Keep watching NDTV.